During World War II, invisible shooters killed enemy soldiers from very far away. The shots came without any sound or warning. Dead bodies appeared everywhere, but nobody could see who was shooting. Frightened soldiers thought the enemy had magic powers. This is the real story of how expert marksmen became so famous and changed how wars are fought forever. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. November 1943, Moro River Valley, Italy. Captain Ernst Weber pressed his back against the cold stone wall. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though it was freezing. Not from fear, though he was afraid. His hands shook because 3 of his men were dead, and he had no idea how they died. Well, that wasn't exactly true. He knew they were shot. But by whom, from where? How? The first man died at sunrise. Private Koch was lighting a cigarette near the observation post. One moment he was alive, laughing about a letter from his girlfriend. The next moment he was on the ground. Dead. Weber heard no gunshot. Just a strange whistle in the air, and then Koch stopped breathing. 3 hours later, Corporal Zimmer fell while carrying ammunition. He was 200 meters behind the front line. This was supposed to be safe ground. The bullet went through his chest. Again, no sound of a gun, just that same whistle, like wind through a crack in the wall. The third death was the worst. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann was a veteran. He survived Stalingrad. He survived the Russian winter. He was careful, always careful. But that afternoon, he looked through binoculars at the Canadian positions across the valley. The bullet went through his right eye. Weber found the binoculars later. One lens was shattered. Blood had frozen on the metal frame. 3 men, 3 bullets, 3 deaths. No muzzle flash. No smoke. No sound until after the bullet had already killed. Weber's remaining men refused to leave the farmhouse basement. 12 soldiers sat in the dark with loaded rifles. They could not fight an enemy they could not see. Young Private Schneider kept whispering the same word over and over. Hexerei, hexerei, hexerei. Witchcraft. Weber wanted to slap him. But he wasn't sure the boy was wrong. How else could you explain it? The Canadians were killing his men from distances that shouldn't be possible. Through fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand. With accuracy that broke every rule of warfare Weber had ever learned. Weber had been a soldier since Poland in 1939. He knew what combat sounded like. The crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, the rattle of machine guns. This was different. This was silent death that arrived without warning. It felt like fighting against ghosts. Or demons. Or something worse. He remembered what another officer had told him 2 weeks ago at headquarters. Captain Steiner from the 94th Infantry Division. Steiner had looked like he aged 10 years in a month. They're not normal soldiers, Steiner had said over cheap wine. The Canadians have something. Some weapon we don't understand. My men are terrified. They won't look out windows. They won't cross open ground. Last week, we lost 5 men in 1 day. All shot from distances we thought were safe. All killed by bullets we never heard coming. Weber had thought Steiner was exaggerating. Or drinking too much. Or maybe losing his nerve. Now Weber understood. Steiner had been telling the truth. Sergeant Harold Marshall lay perfectly still in the mud. He had been in this exact spot for 6 hours. His body was cold. His legs were numb. His back ached. He didn't care. This was normal. In Manitoba, where Marshall came from, you learned to ignore discomfort. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero in winter. You either learned patience or you died. Marshall had spent entire winters tracking wolves through frozen forests. He learned that movement meant death. The hunter who moved first usually lost. Marshall was 32 years old. That made him ancient compared to most soldiers. Before the war, he was a hunting guide. Rich men from Toronto and New York paid him to help them find moose and bear in the wilderness north of Lake Winnipeg. Most of them were terrible hunters. They talked too much. They moved too much. They expected animals to just appear because they wanted them to. Marshall would watch these city men waste bullets on impossible shots. Then they complained that the forest was empty. The forest was never empty. You just had to know how to look. How to wait. He remembered one particular client. A banker from Montreal who paid good money for a week-long moose hunt. The man brought expensive gear. A brand new rifle that probably cost more than Marshall made in 6 months. Fancy binoculars, warm clothing from some outdoor store in the city. But the banker couldn't sit still for more than 20 minutes. He fidgeted. He coughed. He asked questions in a normal speaking voice. Marshall tried to explain that moose could hear humans from hundreds of meters away. That patience was more important than expensive equipment. The banker didn't listen. After 3 days without seeing a moose, he complained that Marshall didn't know what he was doing. That the forest had no animals. That he wanted his money back. On the 4th morning, Marshall woke up at 4 a.m. He went alone to a spot he knew. He sat perfectly still for 3 hours. A bull moose walked past him at 20 meters. Marshall could have reached out and touched it. The moose had no idea a human was there. Marshall let the moose walk away. Then he went back to camp and told the banker there were no moose in these woods. Some lessons couldn't be taught to people who refused to learn. The Canadian Army didn't know what to do with Marshall at first. He wasn't a career soldier. He couldn't march in formation without looking awkward. Other sergeants made jokes. They called him the quiet Indian guide from the frozen north. Marshall was actually white, but he had learned tracking from Cree hunters near his cabin. He knew how to read wind. He knew how to become invisible. Then someone gave him a rifle and asked him to shoot. Marshall put 5 bullets through the center of a target at 400 meters. The range officer thought it was luck. Marshall did it again. And again, and again. He never missed. Not because he had magic eyes or special powers. He never missed because he never took a shot unless he was absolutely certain it would hit. In the wilderness, ammunition was expensive and heavy. You didn't waste bullets. You waited for the perfect moment. Then you made it count. Now, after 6 hours of waiting, Marshall saw what he was looking for. A German officer appeared at the farmhouse window. Just for a second. Checking on his men. 780 meters away, through morning fog. Through cold air that made everything shimmer and dance. An impossible shot by every normal standard. Marshall exhaled slowly. Let his heartbeat settle. He calculated the wind by watching how the fog moved through the valley. He had learned that fog moved differently at different altitudes. Near the ground, it swirled slowly, pushed by the shape of the land. Higher up, it moved faster, driven by winds from the mountains. The German officer's window was at second-floor level. Maybe 6 meters above the ground. Marshall calculated that the wind at that height was moving at approximately 8 kilometers per hour from the northwest. That meant the bullet would drift slightly right. He adjusted his aim 2 centimeters to the left of the target. Then he squeezed the trigger. The Ross rifle kicked against his shoulder. The sound was loud in the quiet morning, but Marshall knew the Germans wouldn't be able to tell where it came from. Sound traveled strangely through fog and valleys. It bounced off hills and buildings. By the time the echo reached German positions, it would seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The German officer dropped. Marshall didn't watch him fall. He was already moving, sliding backward through the dead grapevines. His body stayed flat against the frozen ground. He moved slowly, carefully, making sure not to disturb the plants around him in any way that would look unnatural. The first rule of sniping: one shot, then disappear. Never take a second shot from the same position. Never give the enemy a chance to find you. He crawled 30 meters before standing up. Then he walked calmly back toward Canadian lines like he was taking a morning stroll. His spotter, Private Tommy Chen from Vancouver, followed 10 meters behind with their gear. Chen was a good spotter. He understood the job. Many soldiers thought a spotter just watched where bullets went. But a good spotter did much more. Chen watched for enemy movement that Marshall might miss while focusing through his scope. He recorded every shot in their logbook with exact details. Distance, weather conditions, wind speed, time of day, result. This information was crucial for training other snipers. Chen also protected Marshall while he was focused on a target. A sniper looking through a scope had tunnel vision. He couldn't see threats from the side or behind. The spotter watched their surroundings, made sure they weren't being flanked, and gave warning if they needed to move quickly. "Good shot," Chen said quietly as they walked. "Clean hit." Target dropped immediately. Marshall just nodded. He didn't celebrate kills. Each death was necessary for the war effort, but that didn't mean he enjoyed it. The German officer was somebody's son. Maybe somebody's father. He had a life before the war, dreams and hopes and people who loved him. Now he was gone because Marshall squeezed a trigger. That was the hard part nobody talked about. The killing itself was easy if you knew how to shoot. Living with it afterward was harder. Most military commanders in 1943 didn't understand snipers. They thought sniping was something scouts did when they had extra time. Not a real military strategy. When Marshall first suggested using snipers differently, his company commander laughed at him. "Why waste a trained soldier on single targets?" the commander asked. "Artillery can kill dozens. A machine gun can kill hundreds. Why spend hours setting up one shot?" Marshall tried to explain. "A machine gun makes noise. Artillery makes even more noise. The enemy knows where you are. They can shoot back. But a sniper, a patient sniper who takes one perfect shot and then disappears, that creates a different kind of fear." "What kind of fear?" "Fear of the unknown. The enemy can't see you. Can't hear you. Can't fight you. That kind of fear changes how soldiers behave. Makes them slow, makes them hesitant, makes them easier targets for everyone else." The commander shook his head. "Sounds like a waste of time to me. We need men on the front line, not hiding in bushes taking pot shots." Marshall didn't argue. He had learned that some people had to see results before they believed. Words wouldn't convince them. Most officers didn't listen. But Lieutenant General Guy Simons did. Simons commanded Canadian forces in Italy. He was younger than many generals, only 41 years old, but he had a reputation for innovative thinking. He understood that this war was different from the previous one. Technology had changed. Tactics had to change too. Simons had been watching casualty reports. Canadian forces were fighting hard, taking ground, but paying a heavy price. Traditional infantry assaults against prepared German positions cost hundreds of lives. The Germans were masters of defensive warfare. They chose excellent positions, fortified them well, and made every attack expensive. Something had to change. The Canadians couldn't keep losing men at this rate. When Marshall's proposal reached Simon's desk, the general read it carefully. The idea was simple but radical. Create specialized sniper sections trained in extreme patience and long-range shooting. Use them not just for reconnaissance, but as psychological weapons. Make the enemy afraid to show themselves. Make them change their behavior out of fear. Simons understood immediately. This wasn't about kill counts. This was about controlling enemy behavior. If German soldiers were afraid to man observation posts, Canadian forces could move more freely. If German officers were afraid to look out windows, their units would have worse coordination and intelligence. If German patrols were afraid to move in daylight, Canadian forces would have tactical advantages. So Simons gave Marshall permission to try something new. He authorized the creation of specialized sniper sections. He provided modified Ross rifles. He let Marshall choose his own men. He gave them priority for certain types of ammunition and optical equipment. Most importantly, Simons protected the program from officers like Thompson who didn't understand what Marshall was trying to do. When critics complained about wasting resources, Simons told them to wait and watch the results. Marshall picked his men carefully. He didn't want the best shots in the army, though shooting skill was important. He wanted men with the right temperament. Men who could stay still for hours, men who understood patience, men who didn't need constant action and excitement. He chose hunters. Trappers, quiet farm boys who grew up in isolated areas where patience was a survival skill, men from northern Canada, from the prairies, from remote fishing villages. Men who understood that nature didn't hurry, and neither should they. One of his first recruits was James Wallace, a farm boy from Saskatchewan. Wallace was only 20 years old, but he had been hunting since he could hold a rifle. He could shoot the head off a gopher at 300 yards. He had steady hands and excellent eyesight. More importantly, he had killed his first deer at age 12 by waiting in the same spot for 6 hours until the animal came to him. He understood the patience doctrine instinctively. Another recruit was Francis Pegamagabo, an Ojibwe soldier who had already earned a reputation as an excellent scout. Pegamagabo had grown up hunting and trapping in northern Ontario. He could move through forests so quietly that other soldiers swore he could become invisible. He had an uncanny ability to read terrain and predict where enemy soldiers would appear. Marshall recognized immediately that Pegamagabo was a natural sniper. Marshall also recruited Private Henry Norwest, a Cree Metis from Alberta. Norwest had worked as a ranch hand before the war, spending long days alone on horseback watching for cattle thieves and predators. He had learned to sit perfectly still in a saddle for 12 hours at a time, staying alert the entire time. That kind of patient watchfulness was exactly what Marshall needed. These men became the core of Marshall's first sniper section. They trained together for weeks before seeing combat. Marshall taught them everything he knew about wind reading, distance calculation, camouflage, and patience. But mostly, he taught them to wait. Marshall's weapon was a Ross Mark III rifle. Most Canadian soldiers hated this gun with a passion. In World War I, the Ross rifle had been a disaster. It jammed constantly in muddy trenches. The bolt would seize up at the worst possible moment. Soldiers died because their weapons failed when they needed them most. After that disaster, the Canadian Army switched to British Lee Enfield rifles. The Ross became a symbol of failed Canadian equipment. A reminder of what happened when pride and politics got in the way of practical military needs. Many soldiers who had used the Ross in the previous war still carried grudges. They told younger soldiers stories about watching friends die because their rifles jammed in combat. But Marshall knew something others didn't. The Ross rifle was incredibly accurate at long distances. Its straight pull bolt action was smooth and fast. The barrel was precisely manufactured. The sight line was excellent. In clean conditions, with proper maintenance, it was probably the most precise rifle in the entire war. The problem was that most soldiers didn't take care of their weapons properly. They didn't clean them every day. They didn't protect them from mud and dirt. They didn't maintain them with obsessive attention to detail. Marshall did all those things. He treated his Ross rifle like it was a living thing that needed constant care. He cleaned it every single day, even when he hadn't fired it. He checked every part for wear or damage. He kept it wrapped in oiled cloth when not in use. He never let it touch the ground unnecessarily. And he modified it to make it even better. Marshall adjusted the trigger pull to exactly 3 pounds of pressure. Most rifles had heavier triggers, sometimes 6 or 7 pounds. That was fine for regular infantry who fired multiple shots quickly. But for precision shooting, a heavy trigger made it harder to squeeze smoothly without jerking the rifle. Marshall wanted a trigger so light and smooth that he barely had to think about it. He hand-loaded his ammunition. This was unusual. Most soldiers just used whatever cartridges the army provided. But Marshall knew that factory ammunition had variations. One bullet might have slightly more powder than another. One casing might be slightly heavier. These tiny differences didn't matter for normal shooting, but at 800 meters, they could mean the difference between a hit and a miss. So Marshall measured each powder charge to the exact grain. He weighed each bullet. He inspected each casing for defects. He assembled each round himself, making sure everything was perfect. This took hours of work, but it ensured that every bullet left his barrel at exactly the same velocity. He mounted a Canadian-made telescopic sight with 3.5 power magnification. The scope was attached to the rifle with custom mounts that Marshall adjusted himself. He spent entire afternoons shooting at targets, making tiny adjustments to the scope's position, until the crosshairs aligned perfectly at 800 meters. Other soldiers thought he was crazy. Why spend entire afternoons shooting at targets? Why write down every tiny detail in a notebook? Why waste time measuring powder charges when you could just grab ammunition from the supply depot? But Marshall understood that precision required preparation. In the wilderness, the difference between eating and starving often came down to tiny details most people never noticed. The way wind moved through different types of trees. The way animals behaved at different times of day. The way temperature affected sound and smell. Sniping was the same. Success came from understanding and controlling every variable possible. Wind was the hardest part to master. Wind pushed bullets off course, especially at extreme distances. A bullet traveling 800 meters took more than a full second to reach its target. In that second, wind could move the bullet several feet left or right. Most soldiers thought about wind as a single thing. Either it was windy or it wasn't. But Marshall knew better. Wind was complex. It changed direction and speed constantly. It moved differently at different altitudes. It was affected by terrain, temperature, time of day, and weather conditions. Marshall learned to read wind by watching how fog moved through valleys. How grass bent on hillsides. How snow drifted around rocks. How tree branches swayed at different heights. Each of these signs told him something about wind speed and direction at that specific location and altitude. He created charts showing wind patterns for different times of day in different types of terrain. Morning winds behaved differently than afternoon winds. Valley winds behaved differently than hilltop winds. Coastal winds behaved differently than inland winds. Italian mountains had different wind patterns than French fields. Every location required new calculations, new observations, new adjustments. Marshall also studied how temperature affected bullet trajectory. Cold air was denser than warm air. A bullet traveling through cold air encountered more resistance, which meant it dropped faster and traveled slower. In the Italian winter, with temperatures near freezing, bullets dropped more than they would in summer conditions. He learned that humidity mattered too. Humid air was actually less dense than dry air, which seemed backward to most people. But water vapor was lighter than nitrogen and oxygen. On foggy days, bullets traveled slightly farther and dropped slightly less than on dry days. All of these factors had to be calculated and combined. Wind speed and direction. Temperature, humidity, distance, altitude difference between shooter and target, the angle of the shot. Even the rotation of the Earth at extreme distances, though that was rarely a factor in combat situations. Marshall developed a system for making these calculations quickly. He couldn't spend 10 minutes doing math every time he saw a target. He needed to be able to look at conditions, make adjustments, and shoot within seconds when the opportunity appeared. So he practiced. Over and over. He shot at different distances in different conditions. He recorded every result in his logbook. He looked for patterns. He developed shortcuts and rules of thumb that worked reliably. Eventually, the calculations became instinctive. Marshall could look at fog moving through a valley, feel the temperature on his skin, notice how grass bent in the wind, and know within seconds how much to adjust his aim. But the technical knowledge was only half of it. The other half was something you couldn't teach. The patience doctrine. Most soldiers, when they saw an enemy, wanted to shoot immediately. That's what training taught them. See target, acquire target, eliminate target. Fast and aggressive. The thinking was that hesitation could get you killed. If you saw an enemy and didn't shoot right away, they might shoot you first. That made sense for regular infantry combat at close range. But it was completely wrong for sniping. Marshall taught his snipers to wait. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days. You found a good position with clear sight lines and natural camouflage. Then you became part of the landscape. You didn't move. You barely breathed. You waited until the perfect target appeared at the perfect moment. Only then did you take your shot. This technique came from hunting predators in Canada. Wolves were smart. If they saw movement, they disappeared. You couldn't chase them through the forest. They were faster and knew the terrain better. You had to find their trails, figure out their patterns, and wait along their path. Sometimes you waited all day and saw nothing. Sometimes you waited 3 days. But when a wolf finally appeared, walking calmly because it didn't know you were there, that's when you took your shot. 1 bullet. 1 kill. Then the wolf pack would avoid that area for months. They remembered the danger. They told other wolves through their behavior and their scent markings. That area became a dead zone that wolves wouldn't enter. Marshall wanted the same thing to happen with German soldiers. He wanted them to fear every open space. Every window, every moment of exposure. This wasn't just about killing enemy soldiers. This was about breaking their will to fight. If German soldiers were afraid to move during daylight, that gave Canadian forces freedom of movement. If German officers were afraid to use observation posts, that meant worse intelligence and coordination. If German patrols were afraid to leave their fortified positions, that meant Canadian scouts could operate more freely. The psychological effect of sniping multiplied its practical effect. One sniper killing 2 or 3 soldiers per day might not sound impressive compared to an artillery barrage. But if that sniper made an entire company afraid to move, the strategic impact was enormous. Not everyone agreed with Marshall's approach. Major Richard Thompson, his battalion commander, thought the whole program was wasteful. Thompson was a career officer from Halifax. He had been in the army for 18 years. He believed in traditional military doctrine that had been developed over centuries of warfare. Overwhelming firepower, coordinated attacks. Artillery preparation followed by infantry assault. These were proven methods that worked. He looked at Marshall's logbook and saw 1 kill per day. Sometimes 1 kill every 2 days. Meanwhile, a single artillery barrage might kill 20 Germans. A machine gun section might kill 50 in a single engagement. Why dedicate trained soldiers to a method that produces such small numbers? Thompson demanded in one heated meeting. We're fighting a war here, not playing hide and seek. I have men dying every day trying to take objectives. I need every rifle I can get on the front line. And you want to pull my best shooters out of their units so they can sit in bushes all day waiting for 1 shot? It's absurd. Marshall tried to explain the psychological effect. 1 artillery shell is scary, sir. But soldiers get used to artillery. They learn to take cover when they hear the whistle. They wait for the barrage to end. Then they return to their positions. A sniper is different. A sniper means nowhere is safe. Standing up can kill you. Looking out a window can kill you. Walking from one building to another can kill you. That kind of constant fear wears down soldiers faster than any amount of artillery. Thompson shook his head. Fear. You want to win this war with fear? We'll win it with bullets and shells and good men taking objectives. Your snipers might kill 1 or 2 Germans. My infantry will kill hundreds. But at what cost? Marshall asked. How many of our men die in those assaults? If my snipers can make German soldiers afraid to man their positions properly, your assaults will be easier. Fewer of our men will die. That's speculation. You can't prove that. Give me time, sir. Let me show you results. Thompson didn't want to. He thought the whole thing was a waste. But the decision wasn't entirely his. The authorization for the sniper program came from higher up. From Lieutenant General Simons himself. The argument went up the chain of command until it reached Simons' headquarters. Simons asked to see captured German intelligence reports. These were documents taken from German units that Canadian forces had overrun. They included casualty lists, unit reports, intelligence assessments, and personal correspondence. The reports told an interesting story. German units facing Canadian sectors were requesting transfers more frequently than units facing British or American sectors. Officers were reporting unusual discipline problems. Soldiers were refusing to man observation posts. Some units wouldn't send out patrols unless absolutely necessary. Casualty rates among German officers and NCOs were significantly higher in Canadian sectors. One German major had written in a report, "Morale in the battalion is deteriorating. Men show reluctance to perform basic duties that expose them to enemy observation. 5 NCOs killed in the past week, all at distances exceeding 500 meters. Enemy sniper activity is having a disproportionate effect on unit effectiveness." Another document was a letter from a German private to his family, intercepted by Canadian intelligence. "We call this sector Death Valley. Nobody goes outside during the day. Nobody looks out windows. We hear stories about invisible shooters who can kill from impossible distances. Some men believe the Canadians have supernatural abilities. I don't believe in magic, but I also can't explain what we're experiencing. Men die without warning from enemy positions we can't even see. It's like fighting ghosts." Simons read these reports carefully. Then he smiled. This was exactly what Marshall had predicted. The psychological effect was real and measurable. German units facing Canadian snipers were becoming less effective, not because they were taking heavy casualties, but because they were afraid. Simons authorized expansion of the sniper program. Marshall would train more men. Every Canadian battalion would get dedicated sniper sections. The program would get priority for equipment and ammunition. Marshall would have free rein to develop tactics and training as he saw fit. Thompson was furious when he heard the decision. But orders were orders. He couldn't override a lieutenant general. He had to provide men and resources for Marshall's program, even though he thought it was a mistake. History would prove Thompson wrong and Marshall right. But that wouldn't become clear for several more months. The real proof came in December 1943 during the Battle of Ortona. Ortona was a small fishing town on the Adriatic coast. It wasn't particularly important strategically, but it had become a point of pride for both sides. The Germans were determined to hold it. The Canadians were determined to take it. The town was a maze of stone buildings and narrow streets. Perfect terrain for defenders. The Germans had fortified every building, turned every street corner into a killing zone. They had machine gun nests in basements, snipers in upper floors, anti-tank guns covering the main roads. Canadian infantry was taking terrible casualties trying to clear the town house by house. Every building cost lives. Every street was soaked in blood. The fighting was brutal and personal, often hand-to-hand combat in dark rooms and narrow hallways. After 4 days of fighting, Canadian forces had only advanced a few hundred meters into the town. Casualties were mounting. The attack was stalling. Marshall studied the situation and saw an opportunity. The center of Ortona had a large square surrounded by important buildings. German forces were using the square as a staging area. They moved reinforcements through it. They brought up ammunition and supplies. Officers crossed it to reach different positions. The square was dominated by a church with a tall bell tower. The church was in Canadian-controlled territory, barely. German forces were only 50 meters away in the buildings on the opposite side. Marshall proposed positioning a sniper team in the bell tower. From that height, they would have clear sight lines across most of the square and into windows of surrounding buildings. They could control German movement through the entire area. The battalion commander, not Thompson, who had been transferred, approved the plan. Marshall took 2 men with him, James Wallace and Henry Norwest. They entered the church at night, moving carefully through the rubble. The building had been damaged by artillery. The roof had collapsed in places. The walls were pocked with bullet holes and shrapnel damage. They climbed the narrow stone stairs to the bell tower. The bells themselves were gone, either removed or destroyed. But the tower structure was intact, and it provided an excellent position. The 3 men set up their equipment. They arranged rubble and debris to create camouflaged firing positions. They made sure they could shoot from multiple angles without being seen from below. They brought extra ammunition and water for a long stay. Then they waited for dawn. As the sun rose on December 23, 1943, German soldiers began moving through the square. They thought they were safe. The square was 200 meters from the nearest Canadian position. That was far enough that they felt comfortable moving without excessive caution. The first German soldier to die that morning was a sergeant carrying a radio. He was walking quickly across the open square, probably delivering a message. Wallace's bullet hit him in the chest. He dropped without making a sound. Other German soldiers nearby froze. They looked around, trying to figure out what happened. One of them ran toward the fallen sergeant, probably trying to help. Marshall shot him before he reached the body. Now the Germans understood. There was a sniper somewhere. They scrambled for cover, running toward buildings at the edge of the square. Norwest shot one of them. Then another. For the next 16 hours, the 3 Canadian snipers controlled that square completely. Any German soldier who tried to cross died. Any officer who looked out a window died. Any attempt to move reinforcements through the area failed. The Germans tried to suppress the bell tower with machine gun fire. Bullets hammered against the stone walls, but the Canadians were well protected. They fired back calmly, killing the machine gunners. The Germans tried to bring up a tank to shell the tower. Wallace shot the tank commander as he stood in the turret directing the driver. The tank retreated without firing. The Germans tried sending soldiers through buildings to flank the church. Canadian infantry at ground level repelled these attempts. The sniper team was protected by their own forces below. By nightfall, the German defensive line in that sector had collapsed. They couldn't reinforce positions. They couldn't coordinate between units. They couldn't evacuate wounded. The square had become a dead zone that nobody could cross. When Canadian forces finally cleared that sector 2 days later, they found 17 German bodies in and around the square. All killed by rifle fire. All shot at distances over 100 meters. Most shot through the head or chest with single bullets. But the real impact wasn't measured in bodies. It was measured in the complete breakdown of German tactical control in that area. For 16 crucial hours, 3 men with rifles had done what mortars and machine guns and artillery couldn't do. They had made an entire area completely unusable for the enemy. A captured German lieutenant later told his interrogators about the ghost in the tower. "We couldn't see the shooter," the lieutenant said. His hands trembled as he spoke. "We couldn't hear the shots until after bullets had already passed. Men just fell down dead. We tried everything. Machine guns, grenades, tank shells. Nothing worked. Some soldiers in my company claimed the Canadians had invented invisible bullets. Others said it was impossible for anyone to shoot that accurately. They said the Canadians must have some kind of secret weapon. The interrogator asked, "What did you think?" The lieutenant paused. Then he said quietly, "A few men, usually late at night, believed it was magic. I know that sounds crazy. I'm an educated man. I don't believe in supernatural things. But I also can't explain what we experienced. It was like fighting something that wasn't entirely human." By spring 1944, German intelligence officers were compiling disturbing reports from the Italian front. One report, captured later by Allied forces, contained statistical analysis of officer casualties in different sectors. The document tried to remain clinical and objective, but the concern was obvious even in the dry language. Analysis of officer casualty rates, January-March 1944. Sectors facing British forces, officer casualties represent 12% of total fatalities. Consistent with expected ratios. Sectors facing American forces, officer casualties represent 15% of total fatalities. Slightly elevated but within normal range. Sectors facing Canadian forces, officer casualties represent 38% of total fatalities. Significantly elevated, requires investigation. Further analysis reveals that 67% of officer casualties in Canadian sectors occur at distances exceeding 600 meters. This is highly unusual. Normal infantry combat rarely occurs at such ranges. Conclusion: Canadian forces are employing specialized long-range shooting techniques that are specifically targeting command personnel. Another German intelligence document focused on psychological effects. Behavioral observations of troops deployed to Canadian sectors. Increased reluctance to man observation posts, reported by 78% of unit commanders, reduced patrol frequency, average decline of 54% compared to other sectors, elevated stress indicators including sleep disorders and nervous behaviors, decreased effectiveness even in units that have not yet engaged Canadian forces directly, fear appears to spread through word of mouth. Several reports of soldiers requesting transfer away from Canadian sectors despite no such transfer precedent existing. Anecdotal reports from enlisted men suggest belief in Canadian supernatural abilities or secret weapons. Recommendation: counter-sniper operations must be prioritized in all sectors facing Canadian forces. Current methods are proving ineffective. New approaches required. Wehrmacht commanders began noticing behavioral changes in their troops. Soldiers who transferred from other fronts to face Canadian units quickly adopted new habits. They stopped standing upright, even in rear areas supposedly safe from enemy fire. Officers who tried to enforce normal military bearing were ignored. Soldiers crouched when they walked, kept their heads down, moved quickly from building to building. They refused to use binoculars near windows. Binoculars apparently attracted Canadian sniper fire. Multiple officers had been killed while using binoculars. The word spread quickly, using binoculars near an opening was suicidal. They wore their helmets at all times, even while sleeping. This was unusual. Helmets were heavy and uncomfortable. Most soldiers took them off whenever possible, especially when sleeping or eating. But in Canadian sectors, men kept their helmets on constantly. Some soldiers even wore their helmets in underground bunkers where there was no possibility of being shot. Patrol frequencies dropped dramatically. Before encountering Canadian snipers, German units typically sent out reconnaissance patrols 3 or 4 times per day. After experiencing Canadian sniper activity, patrol frequency dropped to once per day or less. Some units simply refused to send out patrols unless directly ordered by divisional command. Even then, getting soldiers to volunteer for patrols became difficult. Before Canadian snipers, patrol duty was routine. Dangerous, but routine. Afterwards, patrol duty was seen as a death sentence. Soldiers volunteered reluctantly, and many tried to find excuses to avoid it. One German sergeant wrote in his diary, later captured, "Nobody wants to go out anymore. When the lieutenant asks for volunteers for patrol, everyone looks at the ground. Nobody meets his eyes. Finally he just points at 3 men and says, you, and you. The men he picks look like they've been sentenced to execution. Maybe they have been. Of the last 2 patrols we sent out, 1 man came back from the first patrol. None came back from the second. We don't know if they. Nobody wants to go out anymore. When the lieutenant asks for volunteers for patrol, everyone looks at the ground. Nobody meets his eyes. Finally he just points at 3 men and says, you, and you. The men he picks look like they've been sentenced to execution. Maybe they have been. Of the last 2 patrols we sent out, 1 man came back from the first patrol. None came back from the second. We don't know if they were captured or killed. We don't know if their bodies are still out there in no man's land. Command doesn't care. They only care about gathering intelligence. But what good is intelligence if nobody survives to report it? By April 1944, the German High Command had to accept a troubling reality. They were losing a war against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't defeat through traditional means. General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, was in Italy inspecting defensive positions. When he reached the sectors held by Canadian forces, he asked to see casualty reports. The numbers shocked him. "These losses are unacceptable," Rommel said, studying the statistics. "But more importantly, they're unprecedented. I've never seen officer casualty rates like this. It indicates a systematic, coordinated campaign specifically designed to eliminate command personnel." His aide explained the sniper situation. Rommel listened carefully, then asked a simple question: how many snipers are we talking about? Dozens? Hundreds? Intelligence estimates suggest between 20 and 30 active snipers, sir. Perhaps fewer. Rommel was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up from the casualty lists. 20 to 30 men are doing this. 20 to 30 men are tying down entire divisions. Yes, sir. That changes everything, Rommel said quietly. This isn't just a military problem anymore. This is a psychological war. The moment soldiers believe they're being hunted by an invisible enemy, they stop functioning as a military unit. They function as frightened men trying to stay alive. Rommel ordered immediate counter-sniper operations to be established in all Canadian sectors. He brought in German sharpshooters, men specifically trained to hunt enemy snipers. But hunting a sniper is infinitely harder than being a sniper. Snipers hunt from prepared positions with perfect camouflage. Counter-snipers have to search vast areas of terrain, looking for enemies that might not be there, or might be hidden so well that they're invisible. Most counter-sniper operations failed. The Canadian snipers, knowing they were being hunted, simply moved their positions more frequently. They worked in smaller teams. They took fewer shots from any single location. They varied their patterns so that German soldiers couldn't predict where the next death would come from. Marshall understood that the game had changed. The Germans were adapting. They were learning. He had to adapt faster. He developed new tactics. Snipers would work in pairs now, with one man shooting and another drawing enemy fire. The shooter would take one perfect shot, then both men would vanish into the landscape before counter-snipers could locate them. By the time German counter-sniper teams arrived at the shooting location, the Canadians were already 2 kilometers away. Marshall also trained his snipers to think like hunters tracking dangerous predators. German counter-snipers had patterns. They moved along certain routes. They set up in predictable locations. They tried to triangulate shooting positions using mathematics and logic. But they followed rules. They behaved like soldiers. Marshall's snipers began hunting the hunters. They studied where German counter-snipers liked to position themselves. Then they waited for them. A German sniper, thinking he was searching for a Canadian, would set up in a carefully chosen location. And find himself looking down the barrel of a Canadian rifle. By late spring 1944, German morale in Canadian sectors had deteriorated so completely that entire units were requesting transfer. The rate of self-inflicted wounds increased dramatically. Soldiers would deliberately shoot themselves in the hand or foot to be evacuated away from the Canadian lines. German military courts marshaled several dozen soldiers for cowardice, but shooting them didn't solve the problem. It only terrified the remaining soldiers more. Marshal Harold Marshall never became famous. His name doesn't appear in most history books. He received medals and recognition from the Canadian Army, but he never sought publicity or glory. After the war, he returned to Manitoba and went back to being a hunting guide. He lived quietly until his death in 1978, rarely talking about the war. But the tactics he pioneered changed warfare forever. Military forces around the world studied Canadian sniper operations during World War II. Soviet forces adopted similar tactics. The United States created its own sniper training programs based on Marshall's methods. Even today, more than 80 years later, military snipers around the world use principles that Marshall developed in the Italian mountains. The Ross rifle, that once hated weapon from the previous war, became legendary in sniper circles. It was declared officially obsolete by the Canadian Army in 1946, but many marksmen continued to use modified Ross rifles for target shooting and hunting long after the war. Some say a perfectly maintained Ross rifle is still more accurate than many modern weapons. James Wallace survived the war and became a farmer in Saskatchewan. He rarely spoke about his experiences as a sniper, but other soldiers who served with him said he had an almost supernatural ability to remain still and patient. He could sit for hours without moving, without complaining, without needing entertainment or distraction. Francis Pegamagabo became a legendary figure in Indigenous military history. He was one of the most successful snipers of the war, credited with over 60 confirmed kills. After the war, he became a community leader and defender of Indigenous rights in Canada. He died in 1952, and today he is remembered as both a war hero and an Indigenous leader. Henry Norwest was killed in action on August 15, 1944, shot by a German sniper while taking a position to set up for his own shot. He was 26 years old. Today, he's remembered as one of Canada's greatest military heroes, though most Canadians have never heard his name. Captain Ernst Weber survived the war. He was captured by Allied forces in 1945 and spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp. After his release, he returned to Germany and lived a quiet life. In 1968, a Canadian military historian interviewed Weber about his experiences facing Canadian snipers. When asked what he remembered most, Weber didn't talk about specific battles or tactics. Instead, he talked about the fear. It was the not knowing, Weber said, his hands trembling slightly as he recalled those distant days. We knew that at any moment, any of us could die. We couldn't see the enemy. We couldn't fight them. We couldn't do anything except wait and pray and hope that today wouldn't be the day when a bullet found us. He paused, looking out a window at the peaceful German countryside. My men called it witchcraft. I told them it wasn't magic. It was skill. Patience, understanding the land and the weather and how to shoot with perfect precision. It was all very logical and scientific. But you know what? In the end, the result felt the same. It felt like magic. It felt like we were fighting ghosts. And ghosts, I learned, are very difficult to defeat. The historian asked if Weber had any respect for the Canadian snipers, given that they were enemies. Weber considered the question carefully. Then he nodded. Yes. I have great respect. They were soldiers doing their job with excellence. They weren't cruel or brutal. They were professional. They understood war in a way that most soldiers never do. They understood that warfare isn't always about mass and firepower. Sometimes it's about precision. About patience. About understanding your enemy so well that you can predict what they'll do before they do it. He looked back at the historian. If I had the choice to do it again, I would ask to serve somewhere else. anywhere else. But if I had to choose between fighting brave men and cowardly men, would choose the brave ones every time. And those Canadian snipers, they were the bravest soldiers I ever encountered.